Okay, let's start with the French election, which just happened. Now, we last time we talked about that Marine Le Pen is unlikely to get more than the majority, which is what
Mm.
happened. But what is a little bit surprising is she got to the third place, and it seems like the
Mm.
consolidated left they did much better. Is that the how you feel about it?
Well, that is right. What basically happened is this. I understand that in terms of the percentage of the vote, the results were very similar to those of the first round. But what happened was that in individual constituencies, and France has a very complicated electoral system, what happened in individual constituencies is that by arrangement, the various parties that were opposed to Le Pen's party pulled out their candidates, the candidates that had come, last, in order to concentrate on one candidate that would win against Le Pen's. And the result was that constituencies where the left was either first or second place, wing candidate won, and in other places where Macron's candidate was either first, second, or whatever, it was the left wing candidate that pulled out. They supported Macron's party. So the result was a result which bears some elements of manipulation in the sense that we've seen a coming together, if you like, of the centre and left in order to block well acquainted with France back in the 1970s and 1980s. That was exactly what used to happen then. Only interestingly, in those days, the party that suffered from this kind of thing was the French Communist Party, which was in those days very strong. Now it's Marine Le Pen's national rally. The problem is we have a consolidated left whose various component parts do not agree with each other. It was put together very quickly in great haste. So we have the old French Communist Party, which still exists and is still a force in France, though a small one. We have a radical left-wing party led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which is very radical and left-wing indeed, and which also considers itself to be Marxist. And then we have the United States. So this grouping has come together and is emerged as the strongest as a result of all of these things. But I don't think it has much of a mandate to govern. And of course, it's fallen well short of a majority in the
Mhm.
French National Assembly. So, how it's going to lead France is very, very difficult to see.
And yeah, that's my next question. Do you think it's going to be any changes in their policies, in particular, like foreign policies towards Russia, towards China? I guess it's just very hard to say at this point, right? Or Macron will be continue the same. What do you
Well,
think?
Macron is going to remain president. I think after this result, any talk of him resigning has gone because he doesn't have any immediate challenge. So he will remain president of France. As president of France, he continues to have overall control of defence and foreign policy, and with a French parliament in which his party is, I mean, it's far from having any kind of majority, and where his foreign policy is strongly opposed by the largest political group, the left, and by the third largest political group, the right, so the Marine Le Pen's group. So I think that if these two groups come together on individual issues, which they might do, they can block him. So they might be able to block him on sending troops to Ukraine. They might be able to block him on launching missile strikes using French weapons deep inside Russia, because they are left, by the way, the Communist Party of China. That's not the reason. And international economic relations should be organized. And some of them are much more negative about the United States in charge, but a weakened figure.
And about the UK election, I just read that the Liz Truss, George Galloway, Penny Mordaunt, and Jeremy Hunt, they all lost their seats. I thought that's pretty
Uh,
surprising to me.
it is astonishing. I think Jeremy Hunt actually kept his seat,
Oh, okay.
but all of the others that you mentioned lost their seats. Um, this has been one of the most astonishing elections going all the way back. So disastrously low turnout, 59.9%. It's the lowest, the second lowest since 1883. I mean, it's terribly bad. A Labour Party, which has gained a majority, 33% of the vote of the shrunken number of people. Only one person in five who has the right to vote in Britain voted Labour, but they now have a huge, massive majority with the Labour Party. The Conservative Party, a complete collapse, down to 23% of this shrunken percentage of people who voted, which means, by the way, that only 14% of British people with the right to vote voted Conservative in the last election. The oldest political party in the world has collapsed, and I don't think it's coming back. And the big story to take from all of this is that the British people have completely lost confidence in their political class. They have no confidence in the Conservative Party, the dominant party, the once dominant party in British politics. They've turned their back. I think that it's touch and go whether it will survive. They don't have any confidence really in the Labour Party either, whose policies are very similar to those of the Conservative Party. And they are becoming disillusioned with politics altogether. And some of them very tentatively are starting to experiment with parties to the right and to the left. But this is still very early stage. And the party to the right, Nigel Farage, they got 14% again on this very diminished turnout. So we're hardly a huge endorsement. And you get a few scattered groupings on the left where individual leftist figures have managed to break through, but not enough to make a big impression in Parliament. And George Galloway, the reason he lost in Rochdale is because clearly all the main parties, the big parties, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, basically targeted him because he seemed so dangerous that they had to get him out, to keep him out of the House of Commons. So a result which leaves Britain, in my opinion, in a drifting, a government that nobody wants, elected because the previous government was wanted even less.
See, that's part of the reason I myself is not particularly like election in that sense, because election is you can manipulate it, right? I mean, the French election and the British one and the Claire Daly, you know, they mounted as, you know, several candidates, etc.
Yeah.
It just seems like those establishments that they do find ways to get their way in a way. So that's part of the reason I'm skeptical about election in general. That's part of it. Okay.
And I think you've had a good reason. You've been given more reason to be skeptical. Many people in Europe, in Britain, in France, are becoming skeptical as well. By the way.
Yeah. So, what do you feel about the Iranian election? There's so many elections now. Some people call him centrist, and some call, I think, CNN call him reformist, and the Chinese in China people call him pro-West. What is your take on him?
I don't think he's pro-West.
Okay.
A program into his previous statements. I think he's absolutely part of the Iranian establishment. The Iranian establishment is a very complicated political entity. It has reformists and conservatives, and it knows how to balance between them in order to maintain a certain degree of stability within Iran. So under the previous president, Ebrahim Raisi, Iran was very successful in achieving a major diplomatic and economic breakthroughs. So it joined the BRICS, it achieved with China's help a rapprochement with Iran. it has negotiated a big arms deal with Russia. Sorry, with a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. It achieved
Hmm.
a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. It's got an arms deal with Russia. It's looking to develop its trade links with Iran, and it's achieved a major investment program, or so it hopes, with China as well. So, a major breakthrough achieved under the previous president. Now, he was considered conservative on social issues, which basically in Iran means what you put on your head,
Uh-huh.
basically. I mean, that really seems to be
Yeah.
what it's mostly about. So the government, the political class says we've achieved all of that. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are very angry because he takes a hard line. He took a hard line view, the previous president did, on these social issues that made him and the regime to some extent unpopular, especially with younger people. So this is the opportunity to use the election to tilt back towards them by electing a somewhat more moderate figure on these social issues. And overall, he's given some interviews now. He's made it very clear that he's going to continue with the foreign policy that Iran already has. And he's not the person who makes decisions on foreign policy, but I don't get the sense that he's going to want to change Iran's foreign policy direction to any important degree.
Okay. I want to spend some time with about the SCO, the Shanghai Corporation. They just had a meeting. But before we get there, I also want to talk to you about the Central Asia in general. Now, China and the Russia does not always on the same page in terms of Central Asia countries. And I think China always wanted, because Central Asia countries is very rich in their natural resource, right? And so, and the Central Asia countries, they are landlocked countries, so they would like to build pipelines and trains, etc., with China. But Russia wasn't particularly enthusiastic about that. But it seems like it changed. Is that right?
Well, let me explain this relationship, because of course these Central Asian republics were conquered by the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and then they became part of the Soviet Union, and they were constituent republics of the Soviet Union. And that meant that they became part of the Russian political, economic, and the Russians obviously have strong presence there to this day, and very much so. And they have strong security ties and political ties and intelligence ties with these countries. However, it's important to point out that they are not Russians, and it's also important to point out that if we're talking about the history of Central Asia as a whole, the Russians here in the 19th century. China, by contrast, has a history in Central Asia going all the way back to the Han Dynasty.
Yeah.
So, there is already that factor to take into account, connection for that reason with China. And China is a natural trade partner. Now, the Russians have their security interests in Central Asia as well, but they have come to feel that they've come to feel that on the contrary, presence there is in Central Asia, the better it is the better it is for Russia, because China isn't trying to pull these countries away from their relationship with Russia. And both China and Russia have a joint interest in keeping someone else out. And that someone else, obviously, is the United States, because China is a friend of Russia. Russia is a friend of China. But the United States, as we know, is not a friend to either of these countries. So I think this Chinese that many people have been talking about in Central Asia exists more in the imagination of Western media than it does in fact.
Yeah. So what do you feel about the overall, the SCO, this time, the meeting, they just finished, right? The two things, one is Belarus joined. And the other thing
Yeah.
is Modi didn't go. So what's your take on that?
I,
Because
again, I think too much is being made of this. Modi is in Moscow as we speak. So
okay,
he's having a massive summit meeting with Putin where they're going to be discussing economic issues, trade issues. And the reason is that the Russians have a massive trade surplus with India. They don't want to accept rupees because Indian currency isn't really very, you can't use it outside India. And there's problems about using the Russians buying things in India itself because, well, that relationship is not very well developed, and it's not immediately obvious what sort of things the Russians would want to buy in India anyway. So, you know, these are big, complex issues. So Modi had to go to Moscow. It's very important that he go to Moscow in order to resolve this problem. He wants a big meeting with Putin, a meeting that's going to last several days. So he didn't want to hold it within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because there'll be all sorts of other leaders there. There'll be all kinds of other things to discuss. So it makes more sense for Modi to skip that meeting,
okay.
meet directly with Putin, and send his very, very competent foreign minister, Jaishankar, to the SCO meeting instead. Jaishankar is very close to Modi, and he's able to perform the role that's needed very well and very effectively for India, so that Modi himself can concentrate on sorting out the key problems with Russia.
So the significance of the Belarus join then, what do you think the reason Belarus really want to join, or is Russia want Belarus to be in the SCO? I mean, how do you think? And how does that work? You know, once
Russia
Belarus,
most, Russia most, yeah, Russia most emphatically wants Belarus to join the SCO. Perhaps now Russia's strongest ally, having Belarus join the SCO increases Russian influence and also ties Belarus into Russia. But Belarus also has an interest in joining the SCO because Belarus, for many years, tried to play a game of keeping its distance, keeping an equal distance between with Russia and the West. It tried to balance between them. And then 5 years ago, the Western powers tried to organize a regime change in Belarus, and they came very close to succeeding. And the president of Belarus and the government of Belarus realized that this balancing act no longer made any sense. So they committed themselves completely to a much stronger relationship with Russia. But of course, that's not enough because Russia is a powerful country, but it's only one country. You need to balance out your relations. You need other more powerful friends, other powerful friends as well. Gets itself many friends rather than just having to rely on one. And that's why Belarus has joined the SCO. It makes complete sense for them.
and also the difference between SCO and the BRICS, I guess. Now, BRICS is to me like a more pure trade organization. People just trade
Yeah.
with each other. But the SCO from the beginning, it was the like anti-terrorist kind of the idea was,
Yeah.
and they are all neighboring countries, right? The Central Asia, China,
Yes.
and Russia. I mean, and then Pakistan, and they all Iran later joined, but they are all neighboring countries. And when
Yeah.
they talk about anti-terrorist, then I guess there is a military elements to it, whereas the BRICS does not have the military. In fact, they made it very clear, no sanctions, nothing like that. So it's purely trade organization, whereas the SCO there is a military elements to it. Is that right?
This is absolutely correct. But of course, there are military to it, and they are important. But at the same time, they're very, very careful to prevent it, not to present it as an outright alliance.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
coming together of nations that, as you rightly say, border on each other and bring together a very big region, Eurasia, essentially, which have shared security interests and concerns but it stops short of being an outright alliance. And here we see, I think, the skill of the Chinese and the Russians, because what they do is, instead of creating blocks, which is what the Americans do, the EU, the Atlantic system is a block. Instead of creating a block, they weave together whole networks of compatible countries, whilst creating organizations that fit each. So you can create an entity like the BRICS, and to be absolutely clear about this, the driving relationship within the BRICS is the one between China and Russia. Without it, there wouldn't be a BRICS. So you have a BRICS, which is all about trade, currency issues, global economic issues, that kind of thing. Alongside it, you have the SCO, which overlaps, but includes countries that are not part of the BRICS. And and it has a security dimension, which makes it possible for the Chinese and the Russians and all the others to talk about security issues in Eurasia without actually forming an alliance.
And
you're going to get more of this. You're going to get more entities like this all the time.
Well, one example could be the Saudi foreign defense minister is visiting China, and it is a long visit, right? He has been there for like over a week now, and he's talking to the top generals in China, and of course the Chinese defense minister as well, and they're making all kind of arms deal, etc. And there is some talk in China about some kind of a strategic partnership or something. So, what is your take on that?
Well, I think this is very interesting and very important. Now, I think before we discuss this immediate thing, it's important to say that Saudi Arabia and China have long had a close relationship with each other. I mean, we all remember that the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia were on very, very bad terms. But Saudi Arabia and China were not. China always maintained good relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and China share many perspectives on global affairs. They agree on many, many things. And on top of that, the Saudis want to develop their economic relationship with China. They see China as a major customer for their oil, but also a major investor in the Saudi economy, the country that's going to provide a lot of the technology for the upgrade of the Saudi economy that the present Saudi government wants to conduct. And also the security relationship is a very important part of it, because distancing itself from the US, it's looking for other friends because it has lost confidence in the way in which the United States conducts its foreign policy. So it looks to other countries. It looks to Russia, obviously, has a good relationship now with Russia. They have a shared interest because they're both major oil exporters. And the Russians can sell them some weapons too. But of course, the other big power, the other great power, other than the United States, and in some ways a more important and useful power in terms of economic development, is China. And the way the Saudis often develop relations with countries, as explained to me long ago, is through arms deals. So they go to those countries, they buy arms, far more arms than they need. Most of them go into warehouses. But that way, the bridge is established, the contacts are made, and they then move beyond that to other things.
So that's their way. Huh? That's interesting.
That's their way, yeah.
Okay. And speaking of that, not that long ago, Habeck, Germany, finance minister, he visited China. Although that trip, I don't think is that successful. But anyway, and then followed by the Polish president Duda, he visited China. That was a much more successful visit. Yeah. And now it's also planned ahead. Italian Prime Minister Meloni, she is also planned to go. So it seems like now the Europeans are under the pressure from the US to distance from China. And Italy get out of the road and
Belt and Road,
but
yeah.
yeah, but they seems like have a different countries within EU. They develop their own bilateral relationship with China instead. Is that what's going on now?
This is exactly what's going now. The fundamental there are fundamental problems in the EU China relationship, and they all originate from one party, which is again the US. The
Mhm.
US is putting enormous pressure on Europe to sever its economic links with China, and many of these political leaders in Europe are very committed to the Atlantic Alliance.
Mhm.
So they often follow the American dictates. And the new Italian prime minister, or at least when she became prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, did what the Americans wanted her to do. So she took Italy out of the Belt and Road Initiative. I understand that that is now universally recognized in Italy to have been a serious mistake,
Mhm.
that Italy's economic relations and economic development has suffered, and that Meloni herself, and she is not a stupid person. She
Mhm.
understands that it was a mistake, so she wants to go to Italy to restart things. Oh, sorry, she wants to go to
With
China
China.
to restart things in China. By the way, if you know anything about the way the Italian economy works, I mean, all these companies with all these badged products, Gucci and Valentino and all of the rest, I mean, they wouldn't survive without the Chinese market, to
Yeah,
put it
that's true.
mildly. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, they have to. She has to maintain the good relationship with China. The Germans, under something like the same kind of pressures, German industry, business, absolutely desperate to maintain the connection with China. So they go to China as well. Habeck, fierce, fervid Atlanticist, dislikes China, won't, has ideological issues with China. He's not the best ambassador to send, but well, he's the economics minister, so he's the person who ultimately has to go. Duda of Poland, very complicated story there because he belongs to a rival party to the party that forms the Polish government at the moment. Poland, a very divided country, but Poland also wanting to maintain good relations with China for all sorts of reasons, and other countries too. Now, the problem they all have is that as members of the EU, they are supposed to work through the EU in
Mhm.
developing economic and trade relations with a country like China. But the European Commission, the EU
Right.
institutions, have been captured by the United States. So European leaders understand that they can't depend on it anymore to protect their interests in terms of trade with China, which is why they're going.
Yeah. And van der Leyen in particular, she seems like doing everything the US asked her to do, right? And so
Yeah.
with her there, I find it's very hard for EU as a whole to really improve the relationship with China. So individual countries just decided, okay, we go our own way. It seems like that's what's going on, right? So
You're absolutely completely right. Can I say something? I mean, obviously, China, the EU as an institution is destroying its relationship with China, which used to be a very, very strong one. And it's very sad to see. And of course, I remember the way it did the same thing with Russia. There was a time when relations at an economic and political level between the EU as an entity and Russia were fairly close. They used to have bilateral summits with each other. You used to have the European Commission go to Moscow and meet the Russian government, and the Russian government come to Brussels and meet the European Commission, and there'll be all kinds of discussions and agreements reached. And the way all of that has been torn up and shredded is tragic. And they do the same, they're doing in effect the same with China as well. And it's all because Washington wants it so.
yeah, and the van der Leyen in particular, I think in China, people particularly feel like she really is very much working for the United States instead of working for
Yeah.
Europe. That's the
Yes.
consensus in China.
It's they're absolutely right. That's exactly what she does.
Yeah. Uh, Viktor Orban, his trip is interesting, isn't it? He went to Ukraine and then went to Russia, and now he's in China. Now, of course, that angers many people. So there's all kinds of complaints. Oh, you're not representing us. You're representing just Hungary, even though I believe Hungary now is the the EU leader, right? For
Yeah.
now, right? Anyway, so the Chinese take on that is that he is trying to work out some deal. Maybe all these hoopla hoopla criticism, they're just for show.
Mm.
Whatever they are saying, it doesn't really matter. One thing, it seems like NATO knows. NATO, he did discuss this with NATO ahead of time or something. So at least NATO knows that he's doing this. So is he trying to get some kind of a ceasefire or peace deal? Is that what he's doing, mediating?
Well, that is what he says, and I think we must accept that because I mean, it's consistent with what he's doing. And I'm going to say this: all this criticism of him. You're absolutely right. Hungary now is the president, occupies the presidency of the European Union, which means that Hungary chairs all the committees, calls the EU Council into session, prepares the agenda, does all of those things. And the Hungarians are saying, look, we have a war in Europe. There's a major economic crisis, which is largely a product of that war. There's destruction and suffering taking place in Ukraine. They've used that word. There is a very great danger that the thing could escalate. So, what must we do? We must engage in diplomacy to see if there's some way of bringing the war to an end. It is a completely rational, practical approach to the problem. It's very similar to the one that China has, by the way.
Mm.
The ideologues of the European Union and the Western alliance, I think, are generally furious about this because they want war and they want the war to continue. And they've done everything they possibly can to prevent a negotiation taking place. But Orban would say, I'm simply doing my job. I
Mhm.
mean, the fact that no one else is doing it doesn't mean that I mustn't. I now have a responsibility for Europe's future. So, of course, I'm doing my job. I'm going to Ukraine, finding out what the Ukrainians are going to say. I'm going to Russia, finding out what the Russians are going to say. I'm going to go to China because China is a major stakeholder. It's got excellent relations with Russia. It's got historically good relations with Ukraine. It's got its own plans and discussions about how to pursue peace. So, of course, we're going to go to China. And I understand that he's intending to go to well, he will be in the United States apparently for the NATO summit meeting. But it looks as if the Biden administration won't agree to meet with him, at least to discuss this issue. But of course, he might be hoping that Donald Trump, if Trump is elected president in November, might be more interested. So I think that is what Orban is trying to do. And of course, it does work for him personally because he shows to the Hungarian people that, he's got Hungary on the map. It's playing an important role in world diplomacy. He knows that it's well received across the rest of the world. Most people around the world agree with what he's doing. And he also, I think, senses that within all the various different countries in Europe, the mood is shifting.
Yeah.
I was in Germany, as you know,
Mhm.
until the end of last week. I found that more and more people in Germany were telling me straightforwardly that they weren't happy at all about the war and that they wanted to see it end. I think the same must be true in France if we look judged by the results of the parliamentary elections. And I can definitely say that the same is true in Britain. And that had an effect on the elections there also. So I think Orban feels that he's got, the wind in his sails, and that's why he's confident doing what he should do. And he's shown courage, but also pragmatism in doing what he's done.
I have a question here, though, because Ukraine, Zelensky made a law to prohibit to negotiate with Russia. And Russia also said that Zelensky is not a legitimate representative of the Ukraine. So it's hard for them to negotiate directly, isn't it, with that? So they have to, if they started to decide to go seriously negotiate, they have to through a third party. Is that what it
Yeah,
what it
that's
is?
absolutely what it is. That's completely correct. Now, I think the Russians actually probably more flexible about this because I mean,
Okay.
Putin can just change his mind. I mean, he can.
Okay.
The Ukrainians have this law, well, it's a decree. So in theory, Zelensky could just cancel it. But the problem he has is that there are people in Ukraine who don't want him to because, they're fanatical and ideological. And he's just been threatened by the leader of the Azov Brigade, which is one of these neo-fascist far-right brigades, that if he starts negotiating with the Russians, they will come after him. It was quite extraordinary listening to what this man said.
Yeah. But he does seem to soften a little bit. And then the Chinese take on that is because of Biden's poor performance in the debate. It does seem like either Biden probably not even be the nominee from the Democratic Party, or if he is, he will lose. So there's some speculations in the Chinese media saying that he softened because of the debate performance. Do you think there's some truth to it?
There is some truth to it, but I don't think it's the main reason. I mean, the main reason is twofold. Firstly, the situation on the battlefield is going very unfavorably for Ukraine. But beyond that, and the single biggest thing of all, the thing that more than anything else changed Zelensky's and I suspect the Ukrainian leadership's perspective on where the war is going was the failure of the Swiss Peace Conference. The fact that China didn't go, the fact that India sent only a low-ranking representative, the fact that most countries refused to sign the final communique, and so that they had to engage in extraordinary dodges, like getting the Patriarch of Constantinople to sign. And I think that came as a shock in Ukraine, because it made them realize that far from being, support, they were in danger of becoming isolated. In fact, they are becoming isolated. And I think that was a major shock. And it made them realize that if they're going to shore up international support, then they have to start looking like they're being more reasonable than they have been up to now.
Now, from Russia's side, not everything is going perfectly either, because there's several things. One thing I actually do want to talk to you about the corruption in all the militaries. So Putin just fired 4 deputy defense minister, right? Mm-hmm. And China has also punished 2 former defense ministers about the same time. And we all know, and these all seems related to some kind of corruption. Okay. And we all know how corrupted Pentagon is. Most famously, Donald Trump sent some auditors to Afghanistan, and that plane crashed. As far as I can tell, nobody even investigating that crash, what happened. And clearly Donald Trump knows what it means. Otherwise, if it's just an accident, he could have sent more auditors, but he didn't. Yeah. Okay, that was the end of it. And so we all know, how much billions of dollars is missing. Nobody knows where they go, etc. It seems like all 3 countries are experiencing some kind of corruption in their military. Is that the same in Britain as well? Is it a very hard problem to prevent? Is that that's just the way it is? Is that everybody experiencing some kind of corruptions?
Absolutely. Now, it's important to say, that there is corruption in militaries. And one of the reasons that there is corruption in militaries is because of the way in which the arms industries work nowadays, and the very, very big role that the generals, senior generals now have in procurement decisions. So that inevitably means that, you know, if you're Lockheed and you want to persuade the Pentagon to buy your new latest super expensive super duper fighter jet, then you're going to want a general who is on your side. And if that means, you know, paying him a bribe, well, that's not going to be a problem for you. You'd rather get the contract than worry about the bribe. And the same is true to some extent in Britain. It also exists in Russia and it also exists in China. But there is a difference in that in China and Russia, the military production industries are owned by the state itself to a major extent. And in the West, they're not. So there is a much greater degree of control in China and Russia than there is in Britain or the United States. So yes, of course we do have corruption in Britain. In fact, everybody knows it. In the United States, it is on such a vast scale that it isn't even really concealed. But because of the structure of their industries, there's very, very little that governments can do about it, or indeed even want to do about it, because remember, ministers also get their bribes paid to them. Whereas in China and Russia, governments can deal with this, and they do. And that's why people like the former Chinese defense minister have been sacked and he's now been expelled from the Chinese from the Communist Party. So I understand. And why, you know, not just 4 ministers, deputy ministers, but a whole load of others have been sacked as well. Because what has happened in Russia is that Putin began to get so frustrated about the situation with corruption in the defense ministry that he said, look, the way I'm going to sort this out is by appointing a man who is an economist and auditor. So you actually put the auditor in charge. So he goes to all the books. He says, all right, this is where all the problems are. Out you are. Out you go. So, but Putin can do that. The Communist Party in China can do that. In the United States, it's all but impossible to do. And the same is true in Britain.
Yeah. I just find it's interesting. It's all happening at the same time, right? It seems like everybody's clean their Department of Defense.
Well, if we're talking about Russia, the reason it's happened, what has crystallized it is, of course, the war in Ukraine. They're spending an awful lot more money on weapons. They're also wanting to see what all that money that they're spending is actually achieving on the battlefields. So it's concentrated the mind, if you like. So whereas before they tolerated a certain amount of corruption in the defense ministry because, well, who cared if a few people did well for themselves, that the whole thing overall seemed to be ticking along okay. You weren't too bothered. But now it's become really important and they're immediately tightening up. I think in China it's different in that I get the sense that Xi Jinping, the one thing he absolutely hates is corruption. And whenever it appears, he immediately acts to stamp it out.
Yeah. That's a big part of the reason he's popular in China is because he made it very clear he's anti-corruption. Now, of course, the West saying that he's just using that as an excuse to get rid of his political opponents, you know, his critics, etc. Maybe some of them are, but in general, I think people do believe that he's sincere to clean the house. Yeah, I do think. Yeah.
I think he's absolutely sincere. And I know that the British government has been told this by China experts, real British China experts, of which there are several, by the way. And I know that because one of them, who is a personal friend, has told me as much. But of course, they pay no attention.
Yeah. What do you think is going on right now in the Middle East? Is for a while, it seems like Israel and Lebanon is going to start a new war, but that seems no longer accurate, that serious a threat? Is that, I mean, what happened? What's happening right now?
We're in the ebbing of the attempt by Israel to reassert itself and to reshape the Middle East following the Gaza crisis. They have suffered a major military defeat in Gaza. Nobody in the West talks about it in that way, but it's becoming increasingly clear that that is what has happened. Prime Minister Netanyahu's position has been severely weakened politically, and it is only a question of time, I think, before he goes. The United States has been seriously embarrassed as well because they back Netanyahu and Israel to the hilt in Gaza, and they're very, very humiliated by the fact that Israel failed to win, and they've had the debacle of this pier, this harbor thing that they tried to create,
Yeah.
which, they put it up and it was there for a couple of days and then, woo, the wind blew it away, which is like American foreign policy in the Middle East altogether. So they're still thrashing around looking for ways to make themselves appear strong. So lots of talk for several weeks about Israel starting a war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia, and then I suspect the military people on both Israel and the United States came along and said, look, we've already lost in Gaza against a much weaker opponent, which is Hamas. Do we really want to start another war against a much, much stronger one, which is Hezbollah, which is strongly backed by Iran? And I think the Israelis, the result is that they're dithering. They're not quite sure what to do. And probably they're pulling back. It's not a done thing. I mean, it's possible that the hardliners might win out. But overall, the sense I'm getting is that the Americans and the Israelis are on the retreat.
Yeah. Okay. Before I let you go, there's something on the lighter side. In China, there's people have been talking about this for a while. So there's a company called Sweet Baby Inc. It's a Canadian game consulting company. And in China, people call this company extortion company because what they do, they claim what they do is they promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within the game narratives and industry, studios, etc. They charge a very hefty fee for their consulting, 7 million or something. And they have been doing that with major game companies, etc. So recently there is a Chinese company and they make a video game called Myth of Wukong. Wukong is, the main character in the Journey to the West. So they use him as the main character and created this video game. And so this company, not surprisingly, this Sweet Baby company jumped down and saying, we can, give you consulting services, blah, blah. And then they said that the Wukong company said, no, we don't need you. Okay. So they just go ahead with their purpose in the beginning was to focus on the Chinese market. So they don't care all these kind of political correctness, inclusion, diversity, whatever. But the Sweet Baby, they being the extortion company, so they use the social media to start to smear this company, and they're saying, okay, this character is so macho and it's discriminating women, blah blah, the same old.
Oh my!
What's interesting is this, like lots of the netizens, and including this company, the game company itself, they're all saying, if you know anything about Wukong, you should know this. It actually has no gender because this is a monkey coming from a rock, and nowhere in the book ever mentioned its gender. So, isn't that interesting? I really want to hear your take on that.
I absolutely, completely agree. As somebody, by the way, who's read Journey from the West, this is one of the most preposterous things I have ever heard. I mean, it is absolute, complete nonsense. I would hesitate to call Monkey and Journey from the West as an inclusive story because, when it was written, nobody thought in those terms. But if you want to see the sense of tolerance, diversity, interest, humor, sense of fun Chinese civilization on display. That's the book you should go to. I mean, it's brilliant. It has all of these elements. You don't need a consultant company to come along and teach you with all those things. It's absurd. So I mean that they are smearing and criticizing and abusing and spreading awful stories, I can completely imagine, and I'm sure that's exactly what they're doing. But the underlying premise is ridiculous. It shows a complete failure to understand the topic, the novel, the game, I suspect, everything. Chinese culture, everything. I mean, Chinese culture is, by the way, very inclusive. I mean, there'd be times when, things have been different. But I mean, again, I do wish that people in the West would actually familiarize themselves with Chinese culture a little more, would read these Chinese novels of the past, would get a sense of them, and indeed see the film. Because I'm sure you know, there is actually a wonderful cartoon film that was made in the 60s, which I think you can still find. You can, Uproar in Heaven, I think it was called, which you can actually find. Yeah.
On YouTube, yeah. Well, the interesting part about this is that they have been back and forth because this company, Sweet Baby, clearly want to want to extort money. You see, that's what they want. So that's why they smear the company in order to force them to get their consulting services to pay that $7 million. That's what it is. And in the past, they have been successful with other game companies because, developing video game costs lots of money. You don't want to take the chance being canceled. But this Chinese company is just saying, no, we're not playing that game. He doesn't even has a gender, right? In the book, there is nowhere. We don't even know if this is a male or female. The book never said anything about it, right? So the netizens, they always have the best lines. They were saying, the author who wrote this book 400 or 500 years ago, he wrote a character that is foolproof to today's Western countries' political correctness. Isn't that amazing?
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. The netizens are absolutely right. They put it perfectly. Well done. That's all I can say. And I do hope this game company does not succumb to this blackmail, because that's what it is.
No, yeah, I think in the end that this Sweet Baby, they did give up. They kind of like figured out that this is only look bad on them. They're supposed to be helping you to understand diversity, but they don't themselves, right? They don't respect the diversity. And
well, I mean, I think it's been described absolutely. It's clear. It comes across clearly as a kind of extortion racket. I mean, I don't know this company, but this is what it looks like. I mean, complete failure, as I said, to complete misrepresentation of the underlying realities here. And if they've been they've been told, go away, forget it. Please don't ever come back to China again, which is what you should really tell them. I won't be sorry. That's all I can say.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because there has been back and forth. The netizens didn't give up on this one because the netizen this time they feel like you made a fool of yourself, right? Because you don't know what they
absolutely don't know what they're talking about. But by the way, it does tell you about the West today, that behind all of the propaganda, the thing about work, I've said this many times, there's always a certain cynicism beneath the surface, that they may talk a big bold game, but ultimately it's all very grubby and sordid, and it's about money and things of that kind.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. That's one thing. And the second is, again, it explains to you why Westerners find China, but some Westerners, not all Westerners, some Westerners find China such a problem, because China is able to say, I was going to use an unpleasant word, but anyway, go away. I mean, push off. Whereas you see, if it had been a Malaysian game company,
Yeah.
they would
Yeah.
be very intimidated. They might feel that the market that they have to penetrate is the North American and one, and they might pay up
Mhm.
because what choice do they might feel? What choice do they have? China, it isn't like that at all. They can just say, push off. If you
Yeah.
don't, we're certainly not paying you to tell us about our own literature. I mean, that isn't what we're here for.
Well, I think in this case, the problem is that the game company originally just wanted to focus the Chinese market, didn't pay attention at all, but it quickly picked up overseas for the game, so it became popular, and that's when this
Yeah,
sweet baby company see the opportunity. Right, you don't know outside
yeah,
China, we have political correctness, diversity, blah blah.
yeah.
Without knowing their, I think they didn't do their own homework. If you're going to
No,
criticize this character, you need to know something about this character,
of
right?
course.
Before you say something, but they didn't know anything and they just went went with it. But and then also Chinese netizens are getting more and more savvy. That's another thing. Lots of them do
Yeah,
read English, they understand this, and many of them have lived overseas, so they know how to play this game. So they have been very active
exactly.
on Twitter, on social media, etc. That's part of it too, I think.
Exactly, you're completely right. You're absolutely right about both points. About all your points. I mean, it's when it started to get noticed abroad that this is our chance. Let's get our 7 million bag
Yeah.
in. But the netizens, as you rightly say, have become a lot more understanding of what the West is really all about. It's not so different. I mean, it was like in the 1840s. How do you correct problems in trade? Well, you force Chinese people to take opium. Pretty, I mean, that was all about extortion as well, if we think about it in those terms.
Well, it's good that they didn't successful, so they ended up
They're
they
not.
caved. So that's
They caved. They
yeah. So
caved.
it's a
They
yeah. That's
absolutely. I mean, it's a big win actually, and it's one
yeah.
that will reverberate around. I mean, countries. I mean, the consultancy world is actually quite a small one, though a very, very lucrative one.
Yeah.
And the fact that a company in China said no
Mhm.
is going to people are going to notice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good thing. And I myself, I used to be a consultant. I worked for IBM Consulting
Yeah,
for a while. I do notice
yeah,
that lots of times consulting tend to have the tendency to create some problems out of nothing.
yeah,
Because you
yeah,
see, if there is no problem, then there's no business for a consultant, right? If everybody, problem free, then we don't need consultants. So I do find consulting firms are pretty good at making up things. Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, that's absolutely right. But this particular
It
instance
was.
is so grotesque. It is so preposterous.
Yeah. Okay. We have a little bit shorter section because we talked the last time. So I'll let you go.
Okay.
Thank you so
See you
much.
then. Right.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.